3 weeks after my beloved wife Margaret's funeral, her 2 adult children from her first marriage, 52-year-old Bradley and 50-year-old Linda, confronted me in my own living room and told me that I had no right to their mother's money or property since I was just her second husband who had only been married to her for 12 years, and that they intended to contest her will and claim their rightful inheritance as her biological children, who deserved everything she had worked for during her lifetime, including the house where I had lived with their mother and all of her financial assets that they believed should have been left exclusively to them, rather than to a stepfather who had no blood relationship to their family. What Bradley and Linda didn't know as they delivered their cruel ultimatum about my lack of rights to Margaret's estate and their determination to fight for what they considered their exclusive inheritance was that Margaret had secretly created a comprehensive estate plan that included detailed documentation of their years of neglect, disrespect, and financial exploitation of her generosity, along with her explicit decision to leave the majority of her substantial assets to me and to charitable organizations rather than to the adult children who had treated her poorly and had only shown interest in her well-being when they needed financial assistance or wanted to ensure their future inheritance prospects. I'm William Thompson. I'm 74 years old. And this is the story of how my selfish stepchildren's shocking greed and their dismissive treatment of my marriage to their mother led to the most devastating estate revelation that would teach them that treating elderly stepparents as illegitimate family members and assuming automatic inheritance rights can have catastrophic consequences when the deceased parent has been documenting their behavior and making decisions based on demonstrated love and respect rather than biological relationships, and entitled expectations. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The foundation of this family conflict begins 14 years ago when I first met Margaret Williams at a community center volunteer event, where we were both helping to organize a charity drive for local families in need. And I was immediately impressed by her kindness, intelligence, and genuine commitment to helping others despite having recently gone through a difficult divorce from her first husband who had left her financially stressed and emotionally devastated after 28 years of marriage. Margaret's situation when we met included significant financial challenges and emotional recovery from a marriage that had ended when her first husband abandoned the family for a younger woman, leaving Margaret to rebuild her life at age 58, while dealing with the emotional trauma of betrayal and the practical challenges of establishing financial independence and emotional stability as a newly single woman. During our initial friendship and courtship, Margaret shared stories about her complicated relationships with Bradley and Linda, who were adults in their late 30s at the time, but had developed patterns of emotional distance and financial dependence that created ongoing stress and disappointment for Margaret, as she tried to maintain loving relationships with children who seemed primarily interested in her potential to provide financial support and assistance rather than genuine family connection. Bradley's relationship with his mother had been strained for years due to his irresponsible financial management and his tendency to contact Margaret primarily when he needed money for various business ventures and personal expenses, while maintaining minimal contact during periods when he didn't require financial assistance, creating a pattern of transactional interaction that was painful and frustrating for Margaret, who wanted genuine family relationships. Linda's approach to her relationship with Margaret was similarly self-serving and emotionally distant, with sporadic contact that intensified whenever she faced financial pressures or wanted assistance with her children's expenses, but which declined significantly during periods when her own life was stable and she didn't need maternal support or financial help from her mother. Margaret's efforts to maintain positive relationships with Bradley and Linda, despite their patterns of neglect and financial exploitation, were motivated by her deep love for them as her children and her hope that they would eventually develop more mature and caring approaches to family relationships that would provide mutual support and genuine emotional connection, rather than one-sided financial dependency. My 12-year marriage to Margaret was characterized by deep love, mutual respect, and shared commitment to building a life together that included financial stability, emotional support, and active involvement in community service and charitable activities that reflected our shared values and our desire to contribute positively to others' well-being while enjoying our retirement years together. Margaret's happiness during our marriage was evident to everyone who knew us, as she frequently expressed gratitude for finding love and partnership in her later years after the disappointment and betrayal of her first marriage. And she often commented about how our relationship had restored her faith in marriage and provided her with emotional security and genuine companionship that she had never experienced before. The financial recovery that Margaret achieved during our marriage was the result of careful planning, mutual support, and my assistance in helping her rebuild her economic security through wise investments and practical financial management that allowed her to develop substantial assets and achieve financial independence that provided comfort and security during her final years. Margaret's growing wealth during our marriage included successful real estate investments, careful retirement planning, and inheritance from her own parents that she managed wisely with my guidance and support, resulting in a substantial estate that represented her lifetime of work and our shared financial planning and investment strategies that had created significant assets and financial security. Bradley and Linda's awareness of their mother's growing financial success during her marriage to me created increased attention and interest in maintaining contact with Margaret, though their interactions remained primarily focused on their own needs and their concerns about their potential inheritance, rather than genuine interest in her happiness and well-being during her marriage and retirement years. The pattern of Bradley and Linda's behavior toward Margaret during our marriage included sporadic visits that often coincided with their financial needs, holiday appearances that felt obligatory rather than joyful, and limited emotional support during Margaret's health challenges and medical treatments that required ongoing care and family assistance that I provided while her biological children remained largely absent and uninvolved. Margaret's disappointment about Bradley and Linda's lack of genuine involvement in her life was a source of ongoing sadness that she tried to hide, but which became increasingly apparent as she faced health challenges and realized that her adult children were primarily interested in her financial resources rather than her emotional well-being and their family relationships with her, and with me as her husband. The documentation that Margaret began creating 5 years ago included detailed records of Bradley and Linda's contacts with her, their requests for financial assistance, their responses to her health crises and medical needs, and their general level of involvement and support during her marriage to me, creating a comprehensive record of their behavior and their priorities regarding family relationships versus financial interests. Margaret's decision to work with an estate planning attorney to create a detailed will and trust arrangement was motivated by her desire to ensure that her assets would be distributed based on demonstrated love and care, rather than biological relationships and automatic inheritance expectations, with particular consideration for my needs as her surviving spouse, and for charitable organizations that reflected her values and commitments. The secret nature of Margaret's estate planning was intentional and designed to prevent Bradley and Linda from modifying their behavior simply to protect their inheritance prospects. allowing her to observe and document their authentic attitudes and actions toward her and toward our marriage without the influence of financial motivations that might have created false demonstrations of care and respect. Margaret's health decline during the final 2 years of her life provided clear evidence of the difference between my devoted care and support and Bradley and Linda's minimal involvement and assistance, as I managed her medical appointments, provided daily care, and ensured her comfort and dignity, while her biological children remained largely absent except for occasional visits that seemed motivated by duty rather than love. The contrast between my commitment to Margaret's care during her illness and Bradley and Linda's limited involvement was documented through medical records, caregiver notes, and Margaret's own written observations about who was providing support and assistance during her most vulnerable and challenging period, when she needed family support and practical help with daily living and medical management. Margaret's final months included explicit conversations with me about her disappointment regarding Bradley and Linda's lack of genuine care and involvement, along with her gratitude for my love and devotion during our marriage and her determination to ensure that her estate would reflect the reality of who had provided love, support, and genuine family relationship, rather than biological connections and inheritance expectations. The will reading that took place 1 week after Margaret's funeral was attended by Bradley, Linda, me, and Margaret's attorney, with the expectation that the estate would be divided according to traditional patterns that would provide substantial inheritances for her biological children, while giving me some consideration as her surviving spouse, though Bradley and Linda had already expressed their belief that I deserved minimal inheritance due to my status as a second husband. The initial reading of Margaret's will revealed that she had left the family home to me for my lifetime use, along with sufficient financial assets to ensure my comfort and security during my remaining years, while also establishing trust funds for her grandchildren's education that would be managed independently of their parents' control and would provide long-term benefits for the next generation. Bradley and Linda's immediate reaction to the initial will provisions was anger and disappointment about the assets that had been allocated to me and to their children's education, rather than being given directly to them, as they had expected based on their assumptions about inheritance rights and their belief that biological children should receive the majority of any parent's estate regardless of their behavior or involvement. The dramatic revelation came when Margaret's attorney continued reading the will and disclosed the existence of additional documentation that Margaret had requested be shared after the initial provisions were explained, including detailed letters that she had written to Bradley and Linda, explaining her decisions and her observations about their behavior during her marriage and her final years. Margaret's letter to Bradley included specific examples of his financial exploitation and emotional neglect during her marriage to me, with detailed documentation of his requests for money, his limited involvement in her care during illness, and his obvious lack of interest in her happiness and well-being, except when he needed financial assistance or wanted to ensure his inheritance prospects. The letter to Bradley also included Margaret's expressions of disappointment about his treatment of me as his stepfather, and his failure to acknowledge the positive impact that our marriage had on her life and happiness, along with her decision to limit his inheritance based on his demonstrated priorities and his lack of genuine family involvement and emotional support. Margaret's letter to Linda contained similar documentation of neglect and financial exploitation, with specific examples of her daughter's limited involvement in family relationships and her primary focus on financial benefits rather than emotional connections and family support during Margaret's marriage and health challenges. The letter to Linda also included Margaret's disappointment about her daughter's failure to develop a respectful relationship with me, and her apparent resentment about Margaret's happiness in her second marriage, along with detailed explanations of how Linda's behavior had influenced Margaret's estate planning decisions and inheritance allocations. The most shocking revelation in Margaret's estate plan was the disclosure that the majority of her assets, totaling over $800,000, had been left to charitable organizations that reflected her values and commitments, with specific designations for organizations that supported elderly care, women's shelters, and educational programs that would benefit people in need, rather than her ungrateful adult children who had taken her generosity for granted. Margaret's detailed explanation of her charitable giving decisions included her belief that people who had been blessed with financial resources had obligations to help others in need, and her disappointment that Bradley and Linda had never shown interest in charitable activities or community service despite having benefited from her financial support throughout their adult lives. The estate plan also included provisions that would allow Bradley and Linda to receive modest inheritances if they demonstrated significant changes in their behavior and genuine involvement in family relationships and community service over a period of 5 years following Margaret's death, creating opportunities for them to earn consideration through changed behavior rather than automatic entitlement based on biological relationships. Bradley and Linda's reaction to learning about the charitable bequests and the behavioral conditions for their potential inheritances was immediate outrage and accusations that Margaret had been manipulated by me to change her estate plans and deprive them of their rightful inheritance as her biological children, who deserved her assets, regardless of their behavior or involvement during her final years. The accusations that I had manipulated Margaret's estate planning were particularly painful and insulting, given the detailed documentation that Margaret had created independently, and the extensive legal precautions that had been taken to ensure that her decisions were made freely and without coercion, including multiple meetings with attorneys and psychological evaluations that confirmed her mental capacity and independent decision-making. Margaret's attorney's presentation of the complete estate documentation included video recordings that Margaret had made explaining her decisions and her observations about Bradley and Linda's behavior, providing clear evidence that her estate planning was based on her own experiences and disappointments, rather than any influence or manipulation from me or anyone else. The video recordings included Margaret's emotional explanations of her disappointment about Bradley and Linda's lack of genuine care and involvement during her marriage and illness, along with her gratitude for my love and support, and her determination to ensure that her assets would be used in ways that reflected her values, rather than simply rewarding biological relationships, regardless of demonstrated behavior. Bradley and Linda's threats to contest the will and challenge Margaret's mental capacity were met with additional documentation that included medical records, psychological evaluations, and testimony from Margaret's doctors and caregivers that confirmed her mental clarity and decision-making capacity throughout the estate planning process, making successful legal challenges extremely unlikely and expensive. The comprehensive nature of Margaret's estate planning and documentation made it clear that she had anticipated potential challenges and had taken extensive precautions to ensure that her wishes would be respected and implemented regardless of Bradley and Linda's objections or their attempts to claim inheritance rights based on biological relationships rather than demonstrated love and care. The immediate aftermath of the estate revelation included Bradley and Linda's angry departure from the attorney's office with promises to contest the will and fight for what they considered their rightful inheritance. Though their threats were undermined by the extensive documentation and legal protections that Margaret had established to prevent successful challenges to her carefully planned estate distribution. My response to Bradley and Linda's accusations and threats was measured and focused on honoring Margaret's wishes and ensuring that her estate would be distributed according to her explicit instructions and her documented reasons for her decisions, while also expressing sadness about their inability to understand their mother's disappointment and her motivations for her estate planning choices. The weeks following the estate revelation included multiple attempts by Bradley and Linda to pressure me to modify Margaret's estate distribution or to provide them with additional financial support from my own assets, revealing their continued focus on financial gain rather than genuine grief or family relationships following their mother's death. Bradley's specific demands included his expectation that I should provide him with funds to cover his business debts and personal expenses that he claimed Margaret would have wanted me to support, despite the clear evidence in her estate plan that she had deliberately limited his inheritance due to his pattern of financial exploitation and lack of genuine family involvement. Linda's similar demands focused on her belief that I should contribute to her children's college expenses and her family's financial needs, based on what she characterized as family obligations that transcended the specific provisions of Margaret's will and the documented reasons for her mother's estate planning decisions. My responses to Bradley and Linda's continued demands for financial support were consistent refusals based on Margaret's explicit wishes and her documented concerns about their financial dependency, and lack of appreciation for family relationships and responsibilities that extended beyond monetary benefits and inheritance expectations. The legal consultation that I sought regarding Bradley and Linda's threats to contest Margaret's will confirm that her estate planning was legally sound and properly documented, with extensive protections against challenges and clear evidence of her mental capacity and independent decision-making throughout the planning process. The attorney's assessment of potential legal challenges concluded that Bradley and Linda's prospects for successfully contesting the will were minimal due to the comprehensive documentation and the multiple legal safeguards that Margaret had established, though the process of defending against challenges could be emotionally difficult and potentially expensive, despite the strong legal foundation. The charitable organizations that benefited from Margaret's estate were contacted and informed about their bequests, resulting in grateful acknowledgments and commitments to use the funds in ways that would honor Margaret's memory and values, while providing meaningful assistance to people in need who would benefit from her generosity and community commitment. The educational trust funds that Margaret had established for her grandchildren were structured to provide support for their college expenses and educational development, while being managed independently of Bradley and Linda's control, ensuring that the children would benefit from their grandmother's generosity, without the funds being diverted to their parents' financial needs or mismanaged through poor financial decisions. My continued residence in the family home that Margaret had left to me for my lifetime provided stability and comfort during the grieving process, while also serving as a reminder of our happy marriage and the life we had built together. Despite Bradley and Linda's resentment about my continued presence in what they considered their family property. The ongoing conflict with Bradley and Linda included their attempts to convince other family members and friends that Margaret had been manipulated into changing her estate plans, though these efforts were undermined by the extensive documentation and the testimony of people who had observed Margaret's independent decision-making and her disappointment about her children's behavior during her final years. The community response to news about Margaret's charitable bequests was positive and appreciative, with recognition of her generosity and her commitment to helping others, while also providing validation of her decision to direct her assets toward charitable purposes rather than simply rewarding biological relationships, regardless of demonstrated behavior and family involvement. 6 months after Margaret's death, Bradley and Linda's threats to contest the will had not materialized into actual legal action, possibly due to their attorneys' assessments of their poor prospects for success, and the potential costs of challenging a well-documented and legally sound estate plan that included extensive evidence of Margaret's mental capacity and independent decision-making. The behavioral conditions that Margaret had established for potential future inheritances remained in effect, providing Bradley and Linda with opportunities to demonstrate changed attitudes and genuine family involvement over the 5-year evaluation period, though their continued focus on financial grievances rather than honoring their mother's memory suggested that meaningful change was unlikely. My adjustment to widowhood was supported by the financial security that Margaret's estate planning had provided, along with the comfort of knowing that I was honoring her wishes and implementing her carefully considered decisions about asset distribution that reflected her values and her experiences with family relationships during our marriage and her final years. The grandchildren's awareness of their educational trust funds created positive opportunities for them to understand their grandmother's generosity and her commitment to their future success, while also learning about the importance of education and the value of family members who make sacrifices to support future generations' opportunities and achievements. The ongoing management of Margaret's charitable bequests provided regular reminders of her values and her commitment to helping others, creating a lasting legacy that reflected her character and her belief in using financial resources to make positive differences in people's lives rather than simply accumulating wealth for family inheritance purposes. Bradley and Linda's gradual recognition of the strength and finality of Margaret's estate planning led to reduced contact and fewer demands for financial support from me, though their continued resentment and lack of genuine grief or appreciation for their mother's generosity remained evident in their limited involvement in memorial activities and their absence from charitable events that honored Margaret's memory. The first anniversary of Margaret's death was marked by charitable activities and memorial donations that celebrated her life and values, while Bradley and Linda's absence from these commemorative activities demonstrated their continued focus on financial grievances rather than honoring their mother's memory and acknowledging her contributions to family and community welfare. The legal protections that Margaret had established for her estate continued to provide security against potential challenges, while the documented evidence of her decision-making process and her detailed explanations of her choices created a comprehensive record that supported her wishes and validated her assessments of family relationships and demonstrated care versus biological entitlement. 2 years after Margaret's death, the charitable organizations that had benefited from her estate continued to acknowledge her generosity and provide updates about how her bequests were being used to help people in need, creating ongoing validation of her decision to direct her assets toward charitable purposes rather than unrewarding family members who had taken her generosity for granted. Bradley and Linda's failure to demonstrate the behavioral changes that Margaret had specified as conditions for potential future inheritances was evident in their continued absence from family memorial activities and their lack of involvement in charitable work or community service that might have honored their mother's values and indicated genuine character development. My continued enjoyment of the home that Margaret had left to me provided daily reminders of our happy marriage, and her loving consideration for my comfort and security during my remaining years, while also serving as evidence of her appreciation for our relationship and her recognition of my devoted care and support during her lifetime. The educational progress of Margaret's grandchildren with support from their trust funds created positive family legacy and demonstrated the wisdom of her decision to provide for their future success, while protecting the funds from potential mismanagement by their parents, who had demonstrated poor financial judgment and self-serving priorities throughout Margaret's final years. The community recognition of Margaret's charitable legacy continued to honor her memory and validate her decisions about asset distribution, while providing inspiration for others to consider charitable giving and community service as meaningful ways to use financial resources for positive social impact, rather than simply accumulating wealth for family inheritance. Today, 3 years after Margaret's death and the devastating revelation of her secret estate plan, the family dynamics have stabilized into patterns of limited contact between Bradley, Linda, and me, with their recognition that Margaret's wishes will be respected and implemented regardless of their objections or their feelings about being excluded from significant inheritance due to their demonstrated behavior and priorities. The ongoing management of Margaret's estate continues to provide financial security for my remaining years, while supporting charitable causes that reflect her values and provide meaningful assistance to people in need, creating a lasting legacy that honors her memory and demonstrates the positive impact of thoughtful estate planning based on demonstrated relationships rather than biological entitlement. Bradley and Linda's eventual acceptance of their limited inheritances and the finality of Margaret's estate distribution has led to reduced conflict and fewer demands for additional financial support, though their relationship with me remains distant and formal rather than developing into genuine family connections that might have honored their mother's hopes for family unity and mutual support. The wisdom of Margaret's estate planning decisions has been validated through the positive impact of her charitable bequests and the educational support provided to her grandchildren, while the consequences experienced by Bradley and Linda serve as examples of how family relationships and demonstrated care influence inheritance decisions more than biological connections and automatic entitlement expectations. If you like this story, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.